Hello and welcome to this Tuesday afternoon session on the evolving wildfire situation, especially in Southern California, but also regarding the Davis fire near Reno, between Reno and the Mount Rose area, and the broader situation in the West, where there's an extraordinary volume and intensity of fire across many western states at the moment, not just California, but perhaps especially across Oregon and Idaho at the moment, as well as western Montana, western Wyoming, and even up into parts of Canada where it's becoming unusual this late in the season. Just wanted to remind folks that this channel is sponsored by Reask, a company that's helping organizations manage their exposure to future extreme weather risk through predictive and dynamic physics-based modeling. So with that, there is quite the litany of things to talk about today in terms of the wildfire situation that, as I mentioned, has really, and as we had discussed might happen over the past week or so, has now actually done so and escalated across not just California but adjacent states as well. Nationally, at the federal wildland firefighting level, we are now at PL5, preparedness level 5 out of 5, the highest level, which is not common in September. It's not common in general, but it's especially uncommon as we get later in the season, because what it suggests is that there's not just one area experiencing abnormally high large fire activity, but a number of areas in the western U.S. to the extent that it is significantly stretching firefighting resource availability. And one of the reasons why that's important is a significant number of seasonal wildland fire crews. Again, in the U.S. Forest Service, wildland firefighters are actually classed as forestry technicians, which is a bit of an unfortunate euphemism. It doesn't really describe the job. But one other practical implication is that these are seasonal jobs, and this year in particular it sounds like there are going to be a bunch of seasonal firefighters let go in October. So there's not a lot of time before that happens, and there's still an awful lot of fire activity both on federal lands and otherwise. And at least for a couple more days, that situation is going to continue to further escalate before a change in the weather initially increases risk, with strong winds coming into Oregon and California and Nevada as soon as later today into tomorrow, but will then mitigate the situation, at least up in the Pacific Northwest, with rain in that region, and perhaps some mitigation in California with cooler temperatures following the wind, along with the potential for maybe some Northern California showers about a week from now, although that is not certain and could again come with strong winds attached to it. So talk about all of that today, but I really wanted to focus primarily on the ongoing fires, and there are quite a few, most of which of major significance right now are clustered in Southern California. In fact, it feels like the Inland Empire is virtually surrounded by fire currently on almost all sides right now. If you live there, you have almost certainly seen these volcanic-like pyrocumulonimbus clouds, and also likely been experiencing pretty bad air quality over the past several days. Remarkably, though, today's fire behavior is perhaps the most active in the past week, so I will jump to some live imagery in just a few minutes, but just for context, a few relevant data points. Southern California actually experienced one of its most extreme heat waves on record in many areas, particularly including specifically the places that are now experiencing major fires over the past week or so. So that heat wave we saw this past weekend was remarkably intense. Burbank tied its all-time record high temperature not just once, but at least twice, and I'm still looking at the data to see if maybe it did it 3 times over the course of a single heat wave. Other locations, including Long Beach, tied or exceeded the record number of consecutive 100-plus degree days. So this was ultimately a heat wave that did make it all the way to the coast. It wasn't clear that it was going to, but it ended up getting there in the end. Slightly stronger offshore wind push than initially anticipated, slightly hotter air mass aloft. One other consequence is that in the foothill and mountain regions where these fires are currently burning, overnight temperatures did not drop below the 80s. In fact, in some cases, they still haven't since last week, consecutively, even at night. So very warm and dry overnight conditions, allowing vegetation to dry rapidly and fires to remain active in some cases through the night, as occurred yet again overnight last night. And has been the case since the beginning of the heat wave. So this was a very intense and now also quite prolonged heat wave. It's still quite hot out there, although not as hot as it was this past weekend. And the heat is finally starting to fade. The relief will be more pronounced tomorrow in places that haven't yet experienced it today. But again, although this was certainly not a record-breaking heat wave in Northern California, it was in Southern California and also up in the Pacific Northwest, places up in the Willamette Valley, Portland region, also record-breaking. And so this has allowed both the sort of partially dormant wildfires, if you will, that had become much less active in the wake of cool temperatures and rain up in the Pacific Northwest in recent weeks to flare back up with very extreme fire behavior in Idaho, with what I called yesterday a conga line of pyrocumulonimbus clouds, which in fact the underlying fires became so large and intense that they essentially merged together. It's just one gigantic fire now in northern Idaho, producing these fire thunderstorm clouds. But we saw pyrocumulonimbus clouds developing on fires really all the way from British Columbia southward into eastern Washington and Oregon, Idaho, as I mentioned, as well as Wyoming, and now also recently in Southern California. And over this past weekend, Southern California experienced what is arguably its most significant monsoonal surge of the summer. That's not too hard to do because it's been a pretty poor monsoon in California this summer, but perhaps the most significant monsoon-like surge in several years, with some very impressive thunderstorm activity that resulted in significant flash flooding in a few isolated areas, including some lower elevation valley areas in and near the San Bernardino County and a couple of adjacent counties in the southeastern deserts. These thunderstorms did affect the mountain areas and were involved in blowing up some of these wildfires to the extent that they've blown up. In fact, some of these fires ended up either generating their own thunderstorms or hybridizing their convective plumes associated with the hot temperatures at the surface with existing thunderstorms to produce even more extreme plume-dominated and pyrocumulonimbus-dominated fire behavior. What that means is that these wildfires did in fact start producing their own lightning, so full-fledged pyrocumulonimbus clouds, along with spot fires from that lightning. I still don't have a good, I've talked about this before, but I still don't have a good definition of whether fires that become so intense they start their own spot fires through fire-produced lightning, whether or not those are technically considered spot fires of the original fire or a completely new fire. It's largely a semantic difference, but it is remarkable that we saw that happen on a number of fires. But the more consequential problem were the very strong and erratic wind gusts of 40 to 50 miles an hour coming from virtually any and all directions. In fact, there's a number of interesting instances, and we saw this actually live during my last live stream, where these convective downdraft and outflow winds from these pyrocumulonimbus events and nearby non-pyrocumulonimbus thunderstorms caused the fire to blow uphill, blow back on itself, though blow back uphill, and then shift direction by 90 degrees. That's all, of course, quite dangerous conditions for firefighters, and it makes it very difficult to predict where the fire is going to head next. So now that monsoonal moisture is largely out of the picture, and by the way, this was a humid heat wave too, in Southern California. The dew points were Florida-like. You probably noticed this if you were in LA or Orange counties, among other places, during this heat wave, because it was not a dry heat, and that made the apparent temperature even worse than it would have been were it a dry heat wave. So not only did we hit record high temperatures, but record high dew points in many cases, along with record-breaking apparent or heat index temperatures, because humid heat is a lot more difficult on the body than a dry heat. That humid heat is also partly why we saw the thunderstorms and why these fires have been able to generate so consistently their own pyroconvective cloudiness. The challenges, of course, are that now as that heat and humidity is starting to fade, the landscape is continuing to dry out as winds pick up. And so although the heat is down and the instability of the atmosphere is less, these wildfires in Southern California are going to become increasingly terrain and wind dominated as the heat wave moves on, but the legacy of extremely dry vegetation remains with us and likely will remain so for the foreseeable future heading into Santa Ana wind season. So no Santa Ana winds in the cards in the immediate future, but some onshore winds. So again, these are winds blowing from the ocean to land, westerly, southwesterly winds. These aren't particularly dry winds. They're moderately humid winds, but unfortunately, temperatures remain on the warm side, vegetation remains on the extremely dry side, and with many large fires already burning in remote, inaccessible, steep, and heavily vegetated areas, in some cases with little fire history in recent decades, unfortunately these onshore winds are probably going to cause more problems than they solve, and it's just going to cause these fires to shift direction. In fact, we're already seeing that in real time today, causing them to run upslope toward populated areas in some cases. So let me pull, I'm going to pull up some imagery since I know folks are really interested in the live stream. And let's bear with me for just a moment. You're going to see my screen fully shared, and you're going to see the infinite mirror for a moment. And then you're going to see the correct window once I bring it up. Okay, here's satellite imagery. So what you should be seeing, and I'm just going to verify in a moment that this is what you're actually seeing, is a live satellite loop focused on Southern California. So let me just make sure that's actually what's showing up on the tab here. Looks like it was, so I'll go back to it now. Okay. So I'm going to bring up my drawing tool because there's several things. This time I don't think I really have to bring out the drawing tool to show folks exactly where the fire is. It's painfully obvious just by looking at this, but of course there are multiple fires, so I'm going to highlight some interesting features. Okay, here's my drawing tool. This is, whoops, I'm using the text tool here, which is not what I want. Let me just bring up the, let's see, I think I just want the freehand drawing tool for the moment. Okay, so what we've got is, this is the smoke plume emanating from the airport fire. So this is the fire centered right around here in Orange County, Trabuco Canyon, and nearby. This is a fire that ran quickly upslope into the mountains and crested Santiago Peak earlier today, running through the major communications site there. There was some dramatic live video earlier of that happening. Some damage up there, although some of the cameras remained online, so it wasn't a total loss. So I'm just going to keep that circled for reference. And then we have what is called the Bridge Fire. I believe it's in the Angeles National Forest. Over here, you can see this one also producing a very large smoke plume, now moving off to the north and east. I'm going to clear those again just to make sure that I don't clutter this up too much. So again, that's the airport fire. This is the bridge fire. And then getting buried underneath the smoke plume from the other two fires, but you could see it briefly, this is the line fire, and it has not become less active. It's just that there are now 3 different smoke plumes intersecting in this region, and so it's become difficult to see for all the smoke. But the other thing I wanted to notice is, or to mention is, we don't have pyrocumulonimbus clouds today, so fire-generated thunderstorms. We do have pyrocumulus. You can see these white tuffets atop the most intense part of the fires. In each case, they've actually faded a little bit recently, but I'm not so sure that's good news. In fact, what I think is actually happening, and you can kind of see this if I draw some of the outline, these smoke plumes are now starting to become a little more wind-driven, and what you're seeing is they're starting to diverge outward in a specific direction. What this is telling us is that the upper-level winds are oriented largely like this. I'll draw a vector like this, and the low-level winds maybe even a little bit more oriented south from the southwest to northeast. What this means is that all these fires are now going to move in more of an easterly direction, and unfortunately, all of these fires have populated areas to their east, as well as very densely vegetated regions that do not have much recent fire history. It's a little bit different down by the airport fire. There is some recent fire history. It's about 6 years old, although honestly, there's been so much vegetation growth and regrowth in the past 6 years, especially following what were the 2 consecutive wettest winters on record in Southern California, in some places the last 2 years. I think a lot of those burn areas may have filled in under very dry and windy conditions, probably going to be able to sustain this fire moving through. I think it was the Holy Fire footprint in the same general vicinity about 6 years ago. So these are major fires currently burning. There are actually a couple of other fires. There's a new one that started up here. I believe this is in the east side of the mountains going down into the high desert. So it is active. It's about 1,000 acres, but I have a feeling fire crews may get a handle on that before it goes too big. There's another one up by Gorman, but it looks like that has since calmed down, as well as a couple of other fires in Orange County that are smaller, but they're not of major significance right now, so I won't talk about them. But another view that I want to show, and I think this will make it really obvious, so man, look at the size, the spatial area encompassed by the active fire signatures. So I'm just going to outline them right now. The dark black circles are effectively where the fire is. Don't take it too literally, but this is a pretty good indication of where there's active fire line currently burning. And this is pretty much what I see. Those are 3 very large fires, each burning, as I mentioned, the LA Inland Empire metro area is pretty much in this region. And so, as I mentioned, the Inland Empire in particular is really just surrounded by fire now on 3 sides. Here's that other fire up. I don't recall exactly what it's called. Also, another fire down in northern Baja. But again, unfortunately, the 3 fires of most concern are pretty close to major populated areas. The bridge fire in particular is really taking off today. It had been a little bit quieter than the other 2. But right now, each of these looks extremely intense. That's the unfortunate reality is that's pretty much all I got to say about that right now. Okay, I'm going to look at some other regions, live satellite map. We're going to go north to the Reno area. Let me see if I can get a more... Okay, they'll be on the west side. Okay. Not as dramatic a satellite picture, but you can still see this is the Davis Fire smoke plume right now near Reno. As you can see, there's some high clouds moving in, another little mountain wave potentially setting up. I talked about that on the last conversation. I'll bring up the thermal imager really quick so you can see. Again, it's not currently putting up an extremely intense signature. Again, it's in here, that black zone. But the real concern is what is coming tomorrow with potentially 40 to 60 mile an hour wind gusts. And the problem, and I'll show you this map in a moment, is that the fire is in a really inaccessible pocket up toward Mount Rose, including the ski area there now, in a place where strong westerly winds are going to push this downslope and toward the populated suburbs of southern Reno tomorrow. So the National Weather Service in Reno has issued a particularly dangerous situation designated red flag warning. This is an elevated red flag warning. We have not seen one of these in a couple of years. In fact, in the Reno area, I'm not sure we've seen one since 2019. These are a big deal, and they signify a particularly elevated threat to life and property. And the concerning thing is primarily that there is already a fire burning, a 6,000 to 7,000 acre fire in a pretty bad location relative to populated suburbs immediately downwind, given the imminence of a major wind event tomorrow. So that is of great concern. If I zoom out farther and show a west-wide view, you can see that there is a vast quantity of smoke from central Oregon all the way into North and South Dakota. In fact, there's even there's even smoke all the way to the southeast over Kansas and Missouri. So huge smoke plumes blowing from west to east. But what I really want to show, and it looks like there's some pyrocumulonimbus blowing up again in central Oregon today, maybe I'll zoom in there. Yep, and we can see, maybe not, well, it's a little bit hard to tell. I don't know if they're going to be officially designated as pyrocumulonimbus, but these are large and deep pyrocumulus clouds nonetheless, here, and maybe some up in Idaho as well. But what I can show here are the thermal signatures. Each of those black dots, look how many there are and look how large they are. Look what happens if I zoom in to Central Oregon. These are all large and active fires burning in mostly heavily forested areas. So just look, these pock marks across Idaho. Just an incredible amount of fire. Again, seeing in northern Idaho, southwest Montana. We go into Oregon and we see the full picture. Just a remarkable amount of fire. And as I mentioned, even up in Canada, up in northern Saskatchewan, major boreal forest fires. So there's a lot going on when it comes to fire in western North America right now. And the Southern California situation is especially dramatic, but it is far from the only place. And this becomes a problem with resource availability. It looks like the most recent frame on the bridge fire is blowing up a stronger pyrocumulus cloud. So actually, I don't have this imagery right now pulled up, but let me just pull it up on my screen because it might be interesting. You're seeing a Denver-based radar right now, but let me go to the Santa Ana Mountains, Southern California. This might not be the right view, so let me go to San Diego. Ironically, you have to go farther away from the mountains sometimes to prevent the beam from being blocked. This looks like it's a pretty good view. So this is the San Diego radar. I'm going to zoom in. What you can see pretty clearly here in a zoomed in view is just how dramatic these smoke plumes are in Southern California. So again, this is the airport fire, this is the bridge fire, this is the line fire, and although it looks like the line fire the plume is petering out in recent moments, I actually don't think that's what's happening. I think it's beam attenuation where this plume is dense enough that it's getting hard to see through. But in any case, this fire, it looks closer to Wrightwood than it is. The fire is actually a little more down here, centered right now, but unfortunately, it is moving in that direction. And under these conditions, with these winds coming like this today, this is going to be a problem. Again, the fire near Running Springs, and unfortunately it is now most active on its eastern flank and could move in a direction that's threatening the Big Bear area. Here again, the fire in Orange County, right around here is the airport fire, also moving to the north and east. I think Highway 74 was likely going to be jumped later today. And there are evacuations now all the way, I think it's I-15 corridor here. This fire could make it all the way there, and there's even a slight chance it could manage the jump. I think that's a little speculative, but there's a pretty good chance it's going to bump up against the interstate there at some point. Very likely it's going to make it to or cross Highway 74 this afternoon. So this is a pretty serious situation in Southern California. I'm going to check for a moment the comments. Not too many yet, so I will go back and continue to show maps for now. Okay, so here's the watch duty map for Southern California. You can see there's all these fires. There's a few additional ones beyond the ones I mentioned, but those are the big ones. There's even been some fires popping up in some other random spots. But let's just review this for a moment. Again, satellite hotspots, these come across as these red and orange splotches. These are not where the fire is in real time, and in some cases they can be erroneous, as is the case, for example, in this area near Foothill Ranch. The fire did not extend all the way into the suburbs there. That was probably a hot cloud at one point, literally a hot part of the plume. But this part of the fire is real, and it's probably behind the times. The fire, as I mentioned, is apparently already up at Highway 74 down here. There are evacuations in the areas in red, and those are the orders, but there's also evacuation warnings, again, as I mentioned, all the way to the interstate here. Is that I-15? I think it is. Yes. So that's a pretty significant evacuation zone, and this fire is pushing hard to the east and northeast. So if we look at the Santiago Peak cameras, these are the ones that were burned over actually earlier today. So clearly some of them are still online. You can see that view. Look at that landscape. And there is some damage. Some of the structures and some of the towers did burn in this, but clearly the power supply is still up. That fire is blown right through there at a pretty high intensity. You could see fire whirls, all sorts of crazy stuff going on live when it happened. But let's see, here's another view. Let's just see which cameras can see anything interesting right now. Just a lot of smoke in that vicinity. So there's a view of the fire capping out. This is the airport fire live. Pretty big pyrocumulus plume. As I mentioned, it's not a fire thunderstorm. But the downside, of course, is there's no chance of any precipitation. It's quite clear that this acreage for the bridge fire, by the way, is way out of date as we go into the... I'm not actually sure if the fire is in the national forest. I think it is. Okay. Doesn't really matter. Here's the rough footprint. As you can see, the most recent hotspots are on the north and east side of the fire, but it's blown out. It's way out in front of this already. So if we look at some live camera views, here is the bridge fire. Again, it's obviously burning aggressively. That's a pretty big pyrocumulus cloud going on. Here's a closer view. This is a camera that's much closer. As you can see, that's quite active. If I play a 15-minute loop here, yeah, you can see that thing is going big, running upslope in an area with little recent fire history. So this is, again, not a great situation for this portion of the Angeles National Forest and places upwind. This is largely inaccessible topography, except that the margins and the heel of the fire, this is mostly an air show. It's difficult to get crews in there, and in a lot of cases it's not safe. So this fire is really taken off. Now the oldest one and the largest one so far is the line fire over here to the east, southeast of Lake Arrowhead and southwest of Big Bear Lake. As you can see, the most recent hotspots are mainly on the northeastern side of the fire. I'm going to draw a little bit again. Some of these hotspots were backfires that were set by firefighters last night, so some of the fire activity here is actually potentially beneficial fire to protect the Running Springs area, which is here and under mandatory evacuation for a couple of days now. This flank down by Highland is much quieter right now. I think the risk to populated areas, although there are still some evacuations, is likely greatly reduced, but the risk on this quadrant of the fire is still very high. In fact, it is arguably higher than it's ever been as the fire is now moving in this direction. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, what is in that direction is the Big Bear area. So all of Big Bear area is now under an evacuation warning, and I suspect, unfortunately, that at least a portion of this on the western and southern side is going to turn into an evacuation order sooner versus later, since this fire is blowing to the northeast. This camera, I believe, within the past couple hours was run over by fire. Let me see if I play a 2-hour loop if we can see it. That's just a 15-minute loop. That's not long enough. Let's see if it happens if we go back 2 hours. Okay, yes, so there's the dramatic imagery of the flames moving through a couple hours ago. Now the camera is just covered in ash. It's still online though, so the fire has moved through. If I look at the other camera, go back 2 hours, what does that look like? Yep, you can see the fire moving through there again, the flames, the ash. Remarkably, it's still online, but the fire clearly did move through. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the flame front is now past this point. So the fire is already past this point and moving still in this direction. So that's the level of increased concern. Here's the fire down below Running Springs. Again, it's still active. You can see it's still burning, but it doesn't look as bad under the canopy of gigantic smoke plume. This is because of some fortuitous weather and some good luck and some heavy-duty firefighting. So again, Running Spring is not out of the woods, but I'm actually, and you can see it's making a decent run up to the right here actually right now, so that could be a problem. But the bigger concern may actually be the Big Bear area, with less time to prepare than Running Springs had. And as resources become drawn down, this becomes a bit more of a challenge. So that's the main story in Southern California. There is technically a red flag warning in effect in this region right now, although of course adverse burning conditions are in place in a lot of areas. There are other fires burning in California. The most active one in the Sierra right now remains the coffee pot fire that's been burning now for I think a couple of weeks. That's not directly threatening structures, but it's burning mainly in the wilderness right now. Here's the Davis fire. So this is the big concern with the particularly dangerous red flag warning in effect for western Nevada, including Reno and the surrounding areas. Here's the big concern. So this is the footprint right now. So the red outline is the official footprint of the fire as of earlier today. And again, the orange zone is where so this is sort of where a general vicinity of where the hot spots are. Here's the Mount Rose ski area. This is the Mount Rose Highway. So clearly the fire is in that vicinity now. The problem is this is a more heavily forested and harder to access region. It's pretty steep. This is on the eastern slope of the Sierra. When the fire made its initial run like this under wind-driven conditions, you can kind of see exactly where the corridor is. This area does include pockets of wild and urban interface, and there are structures that were lost in this region originally. But now the concern is in this area tomorrow. So all of these suburbs on the south and southwest side of Reno are potentially at risk because the winds, this fire is now burning up in this area. So let me keep that on the map. The fire is burning in this general vicinity right now. The winds tomorrow are going to blow like this, and so you can see why that's a big problem. And what I want to do is, I think I can do this if I get rid of my screen drawing tool, bring up the satellite map just to show what is here. So as you can see, this is unfortunately classic WUI. Look at all of these individual homes intermixed in the pine trees. I mean, the neighborhood. I mean, this is literally called West Jeffrey Pine Road. I think that gives you a pretty good indication of what's going on. But just look at this. You know, you have these, presumably a lot of Jeffrey pines mixed in with some other vegetation, with dozens or even really, this looks like hundreds of homes, and this just extends all the way, you know, into the south and west side of Reno. So that some of the trees turn into brush, but that too will be flammable under strong wind conditions. A lot of this area is at serious risk tomorrow. So this, and potentially as soon as this evening, but really tomorrow is when the particularly dangerous situation red flag warning is in effect. And I am strongly in favor of the National Weather Service offices, by the way, issuing these PDS red flag warnings because they differentiate from your ordinary, yeah, today's got high fire risk, but it's not historically high. The PDS warnings give you a sense that, like, this is the time to think about preemptively preparing for what ifs. What if a fire erupted under these conditions? What is my risk? Should I plan my day differently? And unfortunately, in this case, there is already a fire in a bad location going into one of these events. The concern is that this fire, as I mentioned, is going to continue to move north on the east slopes of the mountains here, where there's plenty of fuel, and then get into a position where it's in perfect alignment with the winds to run into the suburbs tomorrow. So that's the situation. And there are red flag warnings today across a broad swath of the interior west. I mean, look how many fires there are up in Idaho, as I mentioned, in Oregon. That's the situation. Jumping back over to satellite, you can see the bridge fire capping out. I want to show some indication of the weather to come, but let me quickly drop over here and check out what folks are asking. Not too many questions yet. So again, I'm planning on taking those questions at the end. So feel free to start contributing them now as I go through the weather. So this is what we've got right now. Let me zoom in slightly. Again, all else equal, I choose the European model ensemble. as my default model of choice. This is what we had over the weekend. So that strong ridge over Southern California, fading but still present yesterday and now into today. But look at what's lurking up in the Pacific Northwest. So still ridging. This is today. It's still hot in Southern California. Not so hot up in Northern California already. Strong southwest winds. So when we talk about winds in the atmosphere in this context, we go parallel to the isobars for geostrophic winds. So the upper level winds are like this as the trough comes in across the Pacific Northwest. Later this week, this is what tomorrow will look like. This is the concern right now for the Davis fire and to a lesser extent the fires in Southern California. If you draw a line perpendicular to the isobars, these are levels of equivalent, in this case, this is geopotential height, but we'll call them similar to isobars for now. This is indicative, look at that gradient, so the number of isobars, or iso heights, per unit area. That's indicative of a strong pressure gradient. What drives strong winds? Strong pressure differentials. So what we've got and what we're going to have are strong winds at mid to upper elevations going like this across Northern California and across the Pacific Northwest. That's why there's a red flag warning in effect for this region. There's a lot of active fires tomorrow. It'll be cooler. There will eventually even be some precipitation up here, but first we got the winds, and that's the concern. Again, the Davis fire is right around, it's in that blue, red splotch. Southern California, some breezy winds, nothing too crazy, but of course anything is going to be a problem with fires right now. So this is tomorrow. And this is a little bit more of an inside slider. So as I said, this is going to result in some pretty windy, cooler, but windy conditions across California and much of the West. That fades away later this week, and then about 6 days from now, so early next week, there may be, if we're lucky, a low pressure system closer to the coast of California, so less of an inside slider. This would still bring another round of much cooler temperatures and strong winds, but it might do so in a way that favors higher humidity and maybe even some showers across Northern California. Probably not widespread rain, but you can see that trough is significantly farther to the west than this initial inside slider. So this is what the European model ensemble suggests. What happens if we take a look at the American model? It too suggests a trough over California, but it suggests a slightly more inland trajectory. So what's the net effect? If we go to the European model, what do we see in terms of precipitation? So obviously nothing over the next 6 days, essentially. So staying dry, no precipitation on the horizon. But as we get into early next week, there looks like there could be a pretty good chance of a soaking rain along the north coast up by Shasta. That would be good news. And at least a chance of showers as far south as about the Bay Area and the central and southern Sierra. So it's not impossible that some spots in the Sierra could see a few tenths of an inch of precipitation. Along with the cooler temperatures and wind, and then places like the Bay Area could see a tenth or two in that window. Beyond 10 days from now, it's a little less clear. It does not look like a wet pattern is beginning. It looks like if it does happen, it would likely be a one-off for now. But that's not a bad look necessarily. That's potentially up to a few tenths of an inch of precipitation in the northern Sierra, and then maybe up to an inch along the north coast. Not unusual for September that far north, but a bit more unusual would be if there are some scattered showers south to the Bay Area and the Tahoe region, which of course would be beneficial, although nowhere near fire season ending. However, if I look at the American model ensemble for the same period, that's actually not the same period, so let me go back a little bit in time. Here, this is looking at 2+ weeks. The American model is a lot drier than that, suggesting only a chance of showers up along the north coast and in the northern Sierra, and essentially zero chance of showers in the Bay Area and along the Mendocino coast and Central Valley. So depending on which model you're a fan of, historically the European model is a little bit better, so we'll see what pans out. I would call this more of a chance of showers in Northern California about a week from now type situation. Not a season-ending rain event, and probably not as significant as the August rain event we saw along the North Coast even. But if the European model ends up being more correct, it could be a decent rain event along the North Coast, the northern mountains up by Shasta, and even a few tenths in places that could really use it in the northern Sierra. Notably, Southern California does not see precipitation of any meaningful quantity in any of these outcomes, at least as we see it right now. So I don't really see any likelihood of meaningful precipitation in Southern California for the next 2+ weeks. That is, unfortunately, the reality. And what about temperatures? Well, the American model and the European model agree that it will be cooler and cooler than average even as we go into mid-September. But the American ensemble wants to warm things back up to well above average conditions by the end of the month. And this is where there's a notable divergence. The European model, well, I said that, but actually in its most recent iteration, it's largely doing the same thing. So it's a little less aggressive with it, but both models now warming up again by the end of September. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment the screen. You're going to see me again for a few minutes, and I'm going to talk. So let me take a sip of some iced tea, and we can get going. Okay. So again, I'm for the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to take some questions. There's a few that are already coming in. I'll start answering them, and then we can talk about the remainders as they come in, and then I'll take a look at the satellite imagery once again before calling it a day. So I think I answered the first question about relief from fire behavior. In Southern California, it's cooling down, but it's not getting any wetter, and it won't get any wetter for weeks, maybe months to come. So unfortunately, in terms of fuel aridity and vegetation dryness, we're stuck with the legacy of this recent record-breaking heat for the foreseeable future. Dead fuel moistures will increase a little bit as these extreme temperatures moderate, but whenever it's dry and windy, we're going to see high fire risk until seasonal rains arrive, and there's no indication of that happening at all right now. So I am concerned about what this portends about Santa Ana offshore wind season. No major Santa Ana winds in the offing right now. In fact, some stronger onshore winds, as I mentioned, but it is possible that some of the larger fires, especially the bridge fire and or the line fire, could still be burning for weeks, and that does get us into Santa Ana wind season, and that plus any new fires that would develop amid a year that has had an exceptional amount of grass and brush growth following 2 very wet years, record wet years even in Southern California, and now capped off by a record-breaking heat wave. That is not a good combination for fire behavior in Southern California, and accordingly, the federal outlook for the fall from the predictive services in the wildland firefighting context is that Southern California will see continuously elevated fire conditions for a couple more months at least. In fact, there's a special advisory out for the exceptional grass loading and brush growth this year due to favorable growing conditions. That doesn't even include the recent effect of this record-breaking heat wave. And again, the legacy of that heat earlier in the summer is what's keeping risk higher than average in some other parts of California, the Central Coast, the Bay Area, and certain parts of the western slope of the Sierra Nevada. I think that this year we may see fire season begin to attenuate with the upcoming weather pattern. Certainly along the North Coast, I think it's largely over. Northern mountains maybe less so this autumn because they may see some more precipitation. But I don't really see a high likelihood of precipitation sufficient to severely attenuate or end fire season in the southern 3/4 of California in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So whenever there are major offshore wind events, and this would include the Tahoe area, this would include the Bay Area and places south, there could be problems when offshore wind events occur or major prefrontal wind events occur in the next two months or so until those rains arrive. We could get lucky. Maybe one of these outlying ensemble members ends up being correct and we get a more significant rain event in Northern California at some point in the next couple of weeks. But that's not really favored at this point, and so I don't think we should count on it from a fire perspective. In Southern California, that's vanishingly unlikely, despite what some of the AI weather models might have you believe. So that's sort of the outlook right now. I am pretty concerned what might happen along the Central Coast and in Southern California, and perhaps as far north as the Bay Area, although more so in Southern California, when we do see stronger Santa Ana and Diablo wind events later in the season. One thing of note, by the way, is that tomorrow there will be quite strong winds in the Bay Area, 30 to 40 mile an hour gusts, maybe even locally 50 miles an hour. These are not offshore winds, these will be north winds and even northwesterly winds. So they won't be particularly dry necessarily, they'll be moderately humid winds. And so there are no red flag warnings out for the Bay Area right now, but I would caution this: at the end of an especially hot, dry summer, particularly on the hilltops and the mountainsides, vegetation is still really dry. And so although red flag warning criteria may not officially be met in the Bay Area tomorrow, I would probably treat it as such, given dry fuels and strong winds, even though the relative humidity will not be exceptionally low. There could be some wind-driven fires, potential risk, even in places like the Bay Area tomorrow, despite the relatively moist air. And so that is one concern, and we could continue to see conditions like that. Unfortunately, over the weekend, there was a pretty small footprint fire in the city of Clear Lake proper that unfortunately destroyed, it sounds like, 30 to 50 structures, because it was only about an 80-acre fire, but it burned immediately in that wildland-urban interface in a very flammable part of the city and burned a lot of structures. So some significant loss up there. From a relatively small fire, you don't necessarily have to have a very large fire to see large losses. Okay, I'll continue with the questions here. Several folks giving their own situation reports, a lot of smoke and ash, no surprises there. Is there a strong correlation, Zach asks, between strong El Nino and La Nina events and strong offshore wind events? Folks have looked, and honestly, I don't think that there's a really clear association. Ultimately, what you need are these sort of inside slider type low pressure systems and high pressure, which often means cool temperatures across the Great Basin relative to California. So these post-frontal cool air masses over the Great Basin give rise to these pressure gradients that favor offshore winds at large scale. You can kind of have a conceptual model where a strong La Nina might be more likely to produce that pattern, but in practice, I'm not convinced that we actually necessarily see that in real life, so I don't think there's much predictability of offshore wind events at seasonal scale. I just don't think we have that. But what we can predict are the background conditions. How dry is the vegetation? How much vegetation is there from year to year based on antecedent conditions? And here is where the concern is, because of course we have this combination of 2 very wet years, prodigious growth of vegetation, grass and brush in particular, and then we have a recent history of record heat to dry it all out. That's the context that's predictable, and that's the context I think that is concerning, even if I'm relatively agnostic about whether or not we'll see more or fewer or stronger or weaker than usual offshore wind events. As always, it's a race between the first seasonal rains and the first big offshore wind event. This year, I think the first big offshore wind event is more likely than not to win the race, maybe even more so than usual, but that technically remains to be seen. Okay, let's see. There's a question about whether there's any indication of smoke moving to the west into coastal SoCal. There has been some. The smoke pollution from these fires has been worst, as you would expect, across the Inland Empire and in some of the mountain communities, as well as a few other communities right up against the base of the foothills. With the onshore flow, I actually think the coastal areas may be okay for now. because the strong winds are a mixed blessing. It clears out the coastal areas, but it's going to cause these fires to run aggressively upslope, as we're seeing now in the mountains. So clear out the air and west side of LA, but at the expense of the mountain communities potentially burning. That's the unfortunate reality there. These fires are going to be burning for long enough that there will inevitably be reversals of the wind pattern or periods of weaker winds, and down the line there could well be much worse air pollution days ahead, because these fires are not going to be extinguished anytime soon, and they will continue to generate smoke that, when conditions are favorable, may persist. Certainly across the inland valleys and maybe even the LA basin, the western side of the basin later, especially in the overnight hours and on days that are not windy. So there is an interesting point. I'm just tying together a few key pieces here. I'm not sure that the initial spark for any of these fires has been confirmed. Usually that takes a long time for an official investigation. But one particularly conspicuous one, and since I think this one has been sort of anecdotally, informally confirmed, is that the airport fire in Orange County was apparently sparked by a public works crew moving boulders to prevent access to trails in the area to prevent wildfire ignition. So there were apparently people who had been off-roading on vehicles, motorcycles and four-wheelers that have hot undercarriages and can spark fires. The mitigation action was to bring in a couple of loaders to move some boulders to block the entrance to the trail, and apparently that is the process that actually sparked the fire, either through boulders smashing against each other and creating sparks, or possibly a machinery malfunction or overheating of one of the bucket machines. That is how the fire started. So you can add that to yet another list of things done in the name of being responsible that actually caused sparks that sparked large and dangerous wildfires. There's a long history of that in California, and it's not really an indictment of any particular entity or action. It's just a general observation about how easy it is for sparks in the landscape to ignite a fire, even when you're actively trying to make that not happen. These crews even had fire extinguishers on their vehicles, apparently, and discharged them, and it still was not enough to prevent this fire. So multiple people, eyes on it, with multiple fire extinguishers, wasn't enough. So, there are a number of folks who often argue, well, if the vast majority of fires in California are human sparked, why don't we just stop humans from sparking fires? And we can avoid some of them, certainly. A lot of folks say, well, if there's all these human fires, why are there so many arsonists running around? And that does happen occasionally, and sometimes with great consequence. The Park Fire, of course, earlier this year was likely an arson fire, but that's not common. It's almost always accidental fire starts. That's usually what we mean when we mean human sparked fires. And those accidents range from genuine carelessness, if someone throws a cigarette out the window or is using a flaming power tool on a hot, windy day. That's arguably something that could have been completely avoided. But then there are other things that are really not easy to avoid. A crew trying to mitigate fire risks by moving rocks, for example, or someone whose vehicle unfortunately overheats or catches on fire on the side of a highway near the brush, or someone's house in the wildland urban interface that catches on fire. Generally, people don't try and make that happen on purpose, but in the course of being humans and living in society, that there are sparks, and that is the reality. And so, sure, we want to avoid as many of these unintentional ignitions as possible when we can, under the conditions that we don't want them to burn. But the reality is, modern life entails a lot of sparks. There's a lot of potential ignition sources out there, and when conditions are just this extreme from a fire weather perspective, even if a very small fraction of those potential ignition sources create a spark in the vegetation that takes off, that's all it takes. There aren't dozens of fires burning in Southern California right now. There's effectively 3 big ones, but there are 3 really, really big and consequential ones. And so again, all of those started with an initial spark, and at least one of them was sparked by fire mitigation activity. So interesting, I think, for some broader perspective on that. There's a question about some specific locations up in the mountains of Southern California, and to be quite honest, I'm not the person to go to for real-time updates on that. I try and offer updates when I can, but I don't have access to full information at all times, and I'm also not on the clock, so to speak, 24/7, although increasingly it feels like that. But I think, the Watch Duty app is a good place to go these days. It's a good aggregator of a bunch of different disparate sources of information. I mean, that's one of the big problems, is that otherwise you have to have a lot of kind of niche domain expertise as to where to find all of these disparate sources all over the internet. The Watch Duty app brings a lot of those together in a pretty reliable way, in a way that's relatively easy to use. In particular, the evacuation maps are, I think, frankly, easier to access there than they are on any public website, I should say government website at this point, because they're still quite fragmented and often don't work and vary sometimes county by county. CAL FIRE has one now that is decent, but certainly better than it used to be, but still, these are not always up to date, and they don't always mesh information from different sources correctly. So that's definitely my personal advice and my professional advice at this point. The other piece, too, is that these kinds of fires are burning in very complex terrain. The mountains in Southern California, in many cases, are extremely steep and rugged. In fact, they're some of the steepest and most rugged mountains in North America, actually, in LA County, and to a lesser extent in San Bernardino County too. And so that means that, and these fires are also burning in some cases in places that have no fire history in 50 plus years. So the vegetation is extremely dense. There's a lot of fuel out there. It's often not possible to send crews in to go direct. So they will go in neighborhoods and populated areas. They will go in on the highways and to a certain extent Forest Service roads. But to be quite honest, access is limited in a lot of those places. And so there's a lot of air resources, aircraft, mainly planes, but also helicopters, that are being used in this setting. And all of that is to say, I don't think that these fires are likely to be extinguished or contained anytime soon, and some of these evacuation warnings or orders may be long duration, especially on the bridge and the line fires. Maybe a little bit less so for the airport fire, because for better or worse, that thing is going to blow through most of what there is to burn awfully fast in the next few days. But the bridge and line fires could be going for weeks. And there are significant population centers under evacuation orders and warnings. So I think that's going to be a real challenge. One thing to keep in mind is that the San Bernardino Mountains, past couple of years, have seen some exceptional weather events on the opposite end of the spectrum. These are the same places that were isolated for several weeks because of massive historic blizzard with 10 plus feet of snow, if you recall. So some of the folks up there have been dealing with some really extreme whiplash in recent years. In fact, I would actually call attention to that part of the state. So up in Northern California, I'd say the poster child for this whiplash is probably Butte County, with flood, drought, wildfire, alternating combination just over and over and over again for the past 10 or 15 years. But this is also now true down in Southern California, and arguably some of the hardest hit places are in the San Gabriel's and San Bernardino County mountains, alternating between historically severe drought, major wildfires, debris flows, flash floods, extreme heat, blizzards, 10 plus feet of snow, and back again. So, and also, similarly to Butte County, a lot of these areas are relatively remote and are not as resource rich as some of the other parts of the state. So this also increases the challenges, both in terms of the physical geography, in terms of lack of ingress and egress routes, but also just the fact that there's only so many resources to go around in these places. So a particularly big challenge with these long, multi-week wildfire campaigns is that when they're affecting populated areas, those evacuations can be quite prolonged. So even assuming firefighting efforts are successful in protecting most of the structures in the region, which would be good, a multi-week evacuation could still be really hard for a lot of people. I mean, certainly would be for me. So Okay. One more comment from Lori up in McCall, Idaho, that it's windy, smoky, with terrible air and ash. Yes, the only good news up there is there probably will be some rain following the wind in the next 48 hours. So that is good news, but before the rain is the wind. That rain is less and less likely the farther south you go. Southern California, the odds are near zero. In Northern California, 6 days from now or so, they go up somewhat, and we'll have to see what happens with that. But in the meantime, tomorrow, Weather Service in Reno has declared it a particularly dangerous situation, red flag day tomorrow, specifically because of the Davis fire, which will threaten the suburbs of southern and southwestern Reno. And in Southern California, no particularly extreme fire weather conditions, but now left with the legacy of the recent fire weather conditions in Southern California. These big fires will continue to go big as winds increase, even as temperatures decrease. And I'm going to take a quick look at the satellite, which, again, no big changes. These fires are really blowing up, and in particular, the bridge fire is maybe the quote-unquote winner today, after being the sort of the smallest of the pack up to this point. So anyway, thank you, as always, for joining. Please do subscribe to the channel. That helps out greatly. Liking this video is another way to help out. And I may have another live session later this week if conditions warrant. We'll see what happens in the Davis fire tomorrow and how these fires evolve in Southern California. Otherwise, I will probably keep an eye on that potential more significant change in the weather for next week, 6 or 7 days from now. So we will see how that evolves. But in the meantime, thanks for joining. Stay safe out there. If you are evacuated, as I know some of you watching probably are, good luck, and my fingers are crossed. All right, I'll talk to you all soon.